So essentially we're trying to do the impossible here, which is how can we replace IP and BGP? So obviously this is a very challenging issue, and especially for deployment, as IP is already everywhere. And so the question is, why should you actually listen to me? Well, the fact is that we need to know how good the world could get if we can really redesign it. And most people have completely given up on trying to redesign IP and BGP because they simply assume that IP and BGP are there to stay forever, and we don't have a way to replace it. However, as you're going to see, we can really achieve dramatically improved security and availability if we could redesign IP and BGP. And consequently, we anticipate that for some specialized networks, you could actually deploy these mechanisms. For example, for secure communication for smart grid, or for other specialized communications, we could deploy and start deploying these architectures. And so hopefully over time we could then switch over to more secure networks. But let me now talk a bit about this project in more detail.
The first thing that you notice is, if you look at the economics literature, is that trust correlates with wealth. In other words, countries where the trust of people in other people, as measured by various economic surveys, have a higher GDP. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily at this point in economics research that they prove that trust means or implies higher GDP, but there is a very high correlation, which was shown for the last 5 years. So what's the network interpretation of that? Well, the network interpretation of that is that if we can create new safe trust relations in the network, maybe in the internet, then there will be a larger pool of usable services, more cooperation among users, a real network effect, not just a network effect that comes from establishing better communication in a network, which was Bob Metcalfe's original idea. We're talking about network effect at the value level and the application level. There will be increased competition, probably higher productivity, innovation, markets, and ultimately economic development. So if there is one area where you can answer positively the question, how can security create value, it's this one. Namely, if we can actually create security mechanisms that enable new safe trust relations, then this has a high correlation with economic activity or increased economic activity. All right, so this gives us a new focus for security research, and this essentially has some roots in observations about the impact of safety on economic development. So, for example, one of the things that you might notice if you go beyond this building in the park, right at the entrance, there is a statue for George Westinghouse. And Westinghouse was the fellow who invented automated railway signals, automated air brakes in rail cars in 1869, and automated railway signals and stops between 1882 and about 1891 at Union Switch and Signal out here in Pittsburgh. And what that meant, it meant a safe increase in train speeds, more railroad commerce, and new economic opportunities. In fact, this is a proven fact. This is a real implication in economics. It's not just a causality. So economists for the longest time have shown the impact of a railroad and increased train speed in economic development. So with this in mind, I obviously asked the question, how can we actually build new trust relations so that people trust more in a safe way, and we can actually create new economic opportunities. That's really the background for this work. And as part of this background, I'll try to come up with a closure of all trust primitives for sender-receiver protocols, which are probably the vast majority of areas where trust appears.
So this is our baseline architecture, and this comes out of some of our work in ROM-based architectures in the AES and a couple other things. And it has some interesting properties. So the first is that the logic is primarily built out of these ROM lookup tables. And the reason we like them is because they're relatively regular, they have low side channel resistance, and from a design perspective, it's very easy to see when someone's changed something. Right? If someone just tries to insert something random into the design and it's not a ROM lookup table looking thing, that's very easy to see. And the next is the interconnect in the design between the ROM lookup tables is going to be reconfigurable. Right? So this has this nature of an FPGA in that I can then go into each of the ROM sites and directly connect its inputs and outputs to the IOs of the design itself, of the overall chip. Right? And this is the primary issue with Trojan detection, is that I have this controllability, observability problem deep inside the IC. And I, again, cut through the Gordian knot here by just allowing myself to route the direct IOs of a subblock to the IOs of the entire chip. Right? The other nice thing is by having this reconfigurable nature in the IO, I don't have all of my design information inside the design database. Right? If someone copies my design database, they still don't know what the configuration of the interconnect is, and therefore they can't directly copy the design or figure out exactly what I'm going to do. Right? So again, the properties of this design that we like are that first, it's relatively Trojan resistant. Right? The reconfigurable interconnect allows me to probe each of the individual gate sites, and I can backfill the sites I don't use with something that prevents people from filling that in with something malicious. Right? It's relatively side channel secure, and the ROM lookup tables and the very structured interconnect allow me to do very balanced design, and it's cloning resistant again because the design database doesn't contain all of my design information. Okay, so just to wrap up, so what we're interested in here is design for security, right? From the ground up, we're building architectures and basic building blocks that have security as a primary design goal, and we're exploring this along multiple design axes, both at the silicon level and up at the system level. We're taking out another test chip in early 2012, looking at next generation building blocks, and then some of these secure designs.
Another thing that I want to point out is that we ran these experiments long enough to actually be able to measure long-term trends. And what we noticed is that there are absolutely no signs of slowing down. On the x-axis, you've got the date. On the y-axis, you've got the number of domains that are infected. And what you can see is that the search redirection attacks are actually rising over time. Block spam, on the other hand, is declining. Why? Because you essentially need the same underlying machinery for both types of attacks, and it's a lot more profitable to do search redirection attacks. The other thing that we wanted to look at was, as I told you before, we looked at those redirection chains where you go from one site, you're automatically redirected to a second site, then to a third site, then to a pharmacy. That seems like a perfect fit for graph theory, right? Each node is a site, each link is a redirection. Let's build the whole graph based on the data that we got over those 9 months. And this is what we got. So you cannot see it very, very well. But what you can see is that there's this sort of supernova in the middle of the graph. Everything is connected, pretty much. 96% of all infected domains somehow are connected to each other. So when we saw this, we thought, oh, first thought is, there's one guy running all of that, compromising all of those websites. Not quite, but they are in close collaboration with each other. So we tried to figure out a little bit more what was going on. So we looked at that big cluster, this big blob that you saw in the middle of the previous graph, and we ran some clustering algorithms. And what we noticed is that a number of nodes are more closely connected to each other than the rest of the graph. And so we can actually break down that big connected component in some subclusters that have much more links between them. And we identified maybe 10, 12 different such clusters. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are 12 people behind this, but what this means is that there are 10 to 12 different campaigns that took place. So a fairly limited number of people are doing this. Okay? The last thing that we wanted to look at in that line of research was the conversion rate. And so we came up with a very rough, I emphasize this, it's very rough, it's back of the envelope, estimate of how many sales were realized per visits that were made. And to do this, we plugged in statistics that we got from Alexa with backlink information from Yahoo. I don't really have time to discuss the methodology here. I would be more than happy to do so offline. But essentially what we figured is that there is somewhere between 0.3, which is a very conservative lower bound, and 3% of conversion rates. That's actually a lot when you compare it to spam, when you compare it even to Twitter poisoning. So this is the reason why we see this increasing. People make money out of this. Possible intervention, I don't have much time to talk about this, but if you go back to our previous graph where I was essentially linking sites that are redirecting to each other, we plot on this graph the in and out degree of these nodes, meaning traffic that they're receiving, traffic they're sending out. And what you see is that for all the websites that we encountered, we see a handful of them have very large in and out degree. What does that mean? That means that these guys are not pharmacies, they are not infected sites, they are traffic brokers, they are redirecting traffic left and right, and these are the guys who are making money.
The idea is that you start from an unidentified database, a database with images but no name. They may have pseudonyms, such as profiles on Match.com or profiles on Prosper.com. Match.com is a dating site. People obviously use facial images because if you don't upload it, you don't get dates. But they don't use their real names because there is still a social stigma associated with having your profile on the dating site. Prosper is a financial website where people look for loans and they reveal sensitive information such as their credit score. And that's why they don't like to associate their real first and last name to that information, but they still, many of them use photos of themselves because studies have shown that people tend to trust your profile better and are more likely to provide a microloan if they can see your face. Unidentified faces are also those of your faces in the street. So imagine really walking out in the street. Those are the anonymous pseudonym faces. Now you have instead, on the other hand, an identified database. So databases of images with name associated to them. Facebook is the example I was mentioning earlier. 90% of Facebook users in the survey we ran claim to be using their actual first and last name on Facebook. So only about 10% of Facebook users try to use pseudonyms. Facebook has been quite aggressive, and so has Google Plus recently, in trying to force verified identity policies. There is more value in a profile when it corresponds to a real first and last name. It makes it easier to link it to other data, makes the data more valuable. LinkedIn profiles have images and first names. Organizational rosters. I would bet that for most of you in this room, there is at least one image online with your face and indeed your name. So face recognition tries to find a match between a record in an unidentified database, for instance, a face in the street, and a record in the identified database, for instance, a profile on Facebook. Once the match is found, then a presumptive name can be associated to the up till then anonymous face. In the sense that now you can probabilistically say, well, there is a 68% probability that this face is Alessandro's face. But because people online reveal more than just their name, on LinkedIn they reveal where they're working. On Facebook they reveal perhaps their date of birth and their other personal information. We can use then statistical identification techniques to infer even more personal information starting from that, such as maybe their political or sexual orientation, perhaps their credit score, perhaps their social security number. And these additional sensitive information can be then driven back to the up till then anonymous face.
Okay, so some of our results here. So first thing was that we found that regrets are really not all that unusual, and that we're seeing that the majority of people in our surveys have had regrets on Facebook. We find that some of these people do have serious consequences. There's a lot of relationship breaking down and some job loss. But we also find that even when they don't have that sort of serious tangible consequence, there are a lot of other consequences that people find very upsetting. And when we ask them to rate the severity of their regret, that they rate this as very high. So just the feeling of guilt or embarrassment can be very upsetting for people, even if there's no tangible consequence. We also found that many of the regrets actually occurred within a day. Some people regretted it immediately when they posted something, and some people it was 10 minutes or an hour later. But within a day, most people actually regretted what they had done. Okay, so what is it that people regret? We asked them to describe an incident that they most regretted, and then we asked them to categorize it in various categories. And so here you can see some of the big categories of things that people regret. So you can see sex and relationships are among the most common major regrets that people have on Facebook. Use of profanity, alcohol, drugs, violence, politics, underage drinking, and religion are kind of round out our list of top things that people regret. And I have some examples here for you to read. Okay, so yeah, so people may post something about sex that is read by someone that they didn't really want to have intimate details of their sex life. Postings can also interfere with relationships. Profanity can be a bad idea. Posting about your illegal activity and drugs are a big one that we saw. Not necessarily a good idea. And then posting things that are controversial can be problematic. And in this case, we have a business person whose views on religion were not necessarily appreciated by his customers. So besides things that people post, we also found that people would regret some other activities that they do on Facebook. So friending or unfriending people was something that people sometimes regret. Also using particular Facebook applications or tagging people in photos. Sometimes people found that they would tag their friends in photos and then their friends would be mad at them for having tagged them in a photo, especially if it was unflattering. Friending and unfriending were regrettable largely because they actually resulted in some uncomfortable social situations.
Comparing our protocol with Bump, we have quite a number of advantages. We don't have to report any location information. We don't require any accelerometer data. We don't need that sensor. It can work across more types of phones. Since we don't need that other hardware, that opens us up to another class of devices. We provide some high security, and we can have this work for more than just 2 users bumping together at the same time. Up to 63 theoretically, although I think we've tried up to 22 in our experiments. This will work remotely over voice for up to 7 users. But Bump is fun to use, but my 6-year-old would say that he likes ours better.
Our project is called Automate Exploit Generation, where the vision is very simple. Given a program, we want to be able to automatically find bugs and demonstrate exploitability. So let me show you a quick demo. This is that program I just showed you. And full screen doesn't seem to be working. You can see that it's a strict binary. That's what this file said. So it's a complete binary, no symbol table, no source code. We run a single command line here called mayhem, which starts the analysis, and it runs for some amount of time. And after some amount of time, it finds that vulnerability. And it doesn't just find the vulnerability, it actually generates working exploits. So in 16 seconds, we generated a working exploit given just the binary. And in fact, it wasn't just one exploit that we found. We can find several exploits for this vulnerability. We ran this experiment for about a minute, and we produced 18 exploits, all different, all taking different program paths. So when you take the output of our tool and feed it to iwconfig, you get a root shell. So in this program, we found a vulnerability, created an exploit, and owned the system in under 30 seconds, running a single command line. The world in which that's possible is much different than the world we live in today. Everyone talks about how we need to find vulnerabilities. But there's a big difference between releasing a potentially buggy program for which anyone can run an automatic tool and create an exploit, and what we expect today, which is there's a few hackers who can maybe, if they spend enough time, figure out how to exploit it. So there's obvious offensive uses, but I think the defensive uses actually outweigh the offense. For example, a common problem we face is to determine whether the third-party software we use is actually safe. Is that widget I downloaded off the internet or I got from that contractor actually safe? One of the things we're able to do is run it through exploit generation and tell you, no, it's not safe. There are some serious security vulnerabilities. So our research program in this problem really is composed of 4 different